Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Data Science Hangout. I guess welcome back because we weren't here last week for the 4th of July. But I'm Rachel Dempsey. I lead customer marketing at Posit. And Posit's the open source data science company building tools for the individual, team, and enterprise. So thank you so much for hanging out with us today. This hangout is our open space to hear what's going on in the world of data across different industries and to get to connect with others who are facing similar things as you. And we get together here every Thursday at the same time, same place, as long as it's not a holiday. But if you are watching this as a recording in the future on YouTube and you want to join us live, there'll be details to add it to your own calendar below. And I just always want to add, make sure it adds for 12 to 1 Eastern time so that you can join us live. I know a few people had some issues with it on their calendar. And so if you need to re-add it, you can go to the Data Science Hangout site as part of the Posit website too. I know people really love connecting with other attendees here. So if you are interested in connecting with others, I'll encourage you to say hi in the chat, maybe share your LinkedIn or introduce yourself or your base, something you do for fun. But we're all dedicated to keeping this a friendly and welcoming space, the welcoming space that you all have made it, and love hearing from you no matter your years of experience, titles, industry, or the languages that you work into. I'll tell you, if this is your first time, there's a few ways that you can jump in and ask questions or provide your own perspective. But it's also okay if you just want to listen in here too, or chat with people in the Zoom chat. But you can raise your hand on Zoom and I can call on you to jump in. You could put questions in the Zoom chat and just put a little asterisk or star next to it if you want me to read it. Maybe you're in a coffee shop or something. And then third, we have a Slido link where you can ask questions anonymously too. For people who join the Hangout weekly, you've heard me say all of this way too much now. But thank you again for joining us. I'm so excited to be joined by my co-host today, Adam Husein, SVP of Data and Analytics at Firebird Music. And Adam, to get us started here, I'd love to have you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your role, but also something you do for fun outside of work too.
Sure. So in my role, I head all data and analytics and cloud technology for Firebird. And something I do for fun is I am a classically trained pianist. So I like to play piano sometimes. And, when I have 3 young kids, so when they're not all trying to claw on top of me and play the piano with me at the same time.
Awesome. There are a lot of musicians in this Hangout group too. And so you'll probably see lots of guitars in the background of people's video too. But if you do play an instrument, I'll encourage you to share that in the chat here too. But I guess to get us started in sharing a little bit about the ways that you're using data to help artists, could you share a few example use cases with us?
Sure. So let me give a little bit of an overview of Firebird, just for people who may not be familiar.
Yeah, that'd be great.
We're a pretty new company, and we are about 2.5 years old now, coming up on 3 years in October. And the company is small and growing, so we're just over around 40 people right now. And what we are is we're kind of partnering with a lot of different companies, either as an investor or as an affiliate for music management is one of our primary areas. So that's like red light management, which is the largest management company out there. And so we have also worked with, we work with MIC management and Jet management and a few other management companies. So Firebird is actually the largest artist manager at scale. We also have invested in and partner with independent labels like Defected Records and Transgressive Records. We've helped like Transgressive Records. If you guys are fans, may have seen that they just recently opened up a new US division. That's a lot of like the work we've been doing with them. And so that's primarily our spaces. We've also recently gotten into the live event space too and invested in a particular festival that we're working with. I don't know if that's publicly disclosed yet, so I won't name the name, but it may be coming out in a press release later. But the main thing is that across the music ecosystem, there's labels, there's management, There's also publishing companies, and we have a couple of those too, like One Too Many and Tape Roam, which is the Ashley Gorley's publishing company, where they have like over 40 number one country hits. That new one, Post Malone's country single that's top of the charts, like Ashley Gorley was the writer on that one. And so we're touching all the different spaces there between managing the artists, independent music publishing, as well as independent labels. And our goal really is to create a cohesive ecosystem for the artist where they can kind of be in one place and we can have incentives to work with them. The canonical problem I always talk about with people is, you'll go to your record label like your Universal or your Warner to create your album, and you might have a multi-album deal there. You'll put out the album, and then you'll go on tour to promote the album, and you'll have a promoter like a Live Nation, or maybe a smaller promoter or a series of promoters. And your manager and your agent will work together with them to really coordinate your tour. And you'll start your tour. Let's say your album comes out in April. Start your tour in May, and it'll be June, and you'll be midway through your tour, and the label will say, all right, I think the album's pretty much done the number of streams we're looking for it to do. We're going to pull back on our marketing spend now. But you've got dates in your tour through August or September. And now you're like, but I was depending upon all that promotion of the album to help promote my tour. And the economics for the music industry have really shifted over the last 30 years. And so now the artist is making most of their money from the tour and not that much from their recorded music. So you can think about it really clearly. In the 90s, when we used to buy albums, they would cost $15 to $20 for an album. You'd get, 8 to 12 songs, sometimes 16 if you're lucky. And, like you were paying a fixed cost of getting something back. Now you pay $11 a month for Spotify and you get unlimited music and you get to listen to as many songs as you want. So the economics are very different now for an artist than they used to be, right? When we were buying physical albums, they made a lot more money off of that. But now we are in streaming. And so we have a similar problem to the issue that we have with the film and TV industry too, just that the economics aren't quite there in the same way. For them, it's really about linear TV is the issue they're having. And so because of that, the economics have shifted. In music, people are making a lot of their money from the road, but artists also make money from brand deals, partnerships, and a lot of other stuff. And this is why music management is our largest investment, is because it's core to our thesis of we want to partner with the artist and then make money when the artist makes money so that our incentives are aligned with the artist. And that goes back into what we're doing in data science and analytics here, is really our goal is to help the artists connect with their fans, grow more fans, deepen their relationships with their fans, and then build a longer lasting, more profitable, and more impactful career.
Thank you for the background there on Firebird. That's really helpful. So when you say like help them build their fan base, like what's a way that you can use data to help them do that?
Yeah, so a lot of what we're doing is we're taking things that I used to do when I was head of data science analytics for Warner Brothers and really moving that to scaling that out for hundreds and thousands of artists is the goal. And the kind of thing that we do in large companies, like Fortune 100 companies, is we build like a 360-degree view of the customer. You connect all the customers' data. You can think of each of these artists as kind of like a small business. We work with everyone from like Sabrina Carpenter, or like the biggest acts like Lainey Wilson, all the way, or Maggie Rogers, all the way down to like people you may not have heard of, like Cutworms, for example, who are just up and coming right now. And so our goal is really to build scalable data products and solutions, and we're using the Posit stack for a lot of this in order to connect the data for the artists so that we can connect their email to the Shopify and all their other things together, create a unified view of the customer, and build scalable interactive tools that their teams can use. So their management teams, the people working with them day to day, can use in order to help grow and manage their business and make strategic decisions the same way a large company would, but without having to invest the millions of dollars in data teams that large companies would.
So, I mean, looking at your LinkedIn and chatting with you, Adam, you've worked at some really cool companies, from some of the largest video game publishers, Warner Brothers, and now Firebird. And I was just wondering, like, is this you following in what you're passionate about?
Yeah, for sure. I've been really lucky throughout my career to be able to work in a lot of areas where I'm really passionate. So, I kind of joke that I've kind of completed the entertainment industry bingo card. Got video games, I've got film and TV and streaming, and now I have music. So
Do you have any advice for some of us who are maybe thinking about like going the direction in a company that we're passionate about, but maybe don't yet have like the industry experience there?
yeah, I would say we're really fortunate as data professionals that industry experience isn't always the most important thing when it comes to data careers, because you can use a lot of the same techniques in different industries and they apply. The other thing is sometimes it's actually a benefit, and some hiring managers and some interviews you can convey that this is a benefit because you can also bring an outside perspective. Because oftentimes you just hire people in the industry, they're going to look at the data the same way. They're going to apply the same algorithms and say, "Oh, I use this type of regression on this problem at this other company, so I'm going to do it here." Whereas, someone coming at new from a different industry or different perspective might really take a broader view and come up with a different way of doing things, which could be new and innovative.
Thank you. I see a few questions coming in the chat here. And Arsenis, do you want to go first here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. And thank you for joining us, Adam. Really appreciate it. My question was really simple, just on the music side. So, data science has been used for marketing in a lot of different ways, especially in changing landscapes like the one you described. But I'm curious about how data science, if at all, has been used to maybe develop content. Say, for example, determining the chords or the tempo for a particular song or anything like that. Wondering if you've had experience with anything like that that you could speak to.
Yeah, I mean, on our side, we're really working on the business side of things, right? Helping them optimize their businesses. It's the same philosophy I had at Warner Brothers, which is that we can help you evaluate like the market potential for your content, but we don't want to be in the business of telling creatives how to create.
Got it.
I think there was a question earlier from Bolivar as well. And I think this might be a question to everybody here. So people feel free to weigh in the chat as well. But do you want to jump in?
Uh, Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I guess it's just a general question of you said, some of those attributes from like coming from other industries might be, well received, but kind of just in the job market now, and there's a lot of things to or requirements to meet, and how do you, I guess leverage or see people that are coming from academia where it's more like open source art and not necessarily some of the fancy cutting edge technologies that other data industries use.
Well, I wouldn't sell R short. I mean, I use R
Yes,
extensively.
yes.
I don't think that's not cutting edge. There's still like new versions being pushed all the time, like a couple times a year, and new packages and thousands of libraries. And in fact, when it comes to data stuff, oftentimes you find that other languages like Python are emulating things that R does, like with pandas, for example, emulating R data frames, and Matplotlib emulating ggplot. So I wouldn't sell yourself short or sell your academic experience short. I do think that the transition from academia to industry is a bit of a rocky one for some people. Some people find it really easy and seamless. Some people find it a bit more turbulent. And I think the main thing to focus on, right, is in business, it's really it moves at a bit of a faster pace, and it's a little bit more of focused on the business outcomes rather than in academia. It's about creating something novel and new, right? And so it's important to adapt a little bit there and make sure that you're focused on what is the overall goal of the business. How does the business make money, or how does it gain new customers, or what are our targets? And then how does the work that you do focus on improving that? And then if you do that, you'll be very successful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I see Alan had a question. Do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Adam. I'm curious, I'd like to hear more about like what kinds of decisions do you see getting made differently or in a more informed way by like, I don't know if it's an artist or their team, can you give some examples of like what gets shaped by the data that you provide in terms of like what they go out and do, how they change their, their strategy about a release or a tour or whatever?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, first of all, we're still new. I've been here less than a year, and I really started hiring for the team about 6 months ago. So we spent a lot of time in the beginning building the data warehouse and signing deals to buy data from a lot of providers. And so we've just started putting tools in people's hands in the last couple months. I think the main things we've seen so far that people are doing is, for example, on e-commerce, they're using it to make decisions about product strategy and what kinds of products to create. We're also getting a lot of questions that we're building tools to help solve, and which will be solved in a period of time over the next few months. So, for example, inventory management is very difficult because these guys aren't supply chain experts, and they shouldn't need to be supply chain experts. And so giving them automated inventory views, low stock alerts, estimates for days on hand of inventory, things like that in an automated fashion, which they don't have. And they don't, most of these merch companies that they partner with for selling the merch are also small companies that do a few $1 million a year in revenue. So they're not huge, and they're not used to doing like supply chain analytics either. And so their idea of analytics is typically like, hey, I produced a royalty statement and there's a report. I told you like how much stuff we sold. And, so it's, entry level, and that's helpful. I don't want to disparage that. It's definitely something you need, but there's more room to improve upon that. And so I think that's where we are right now, is we're starting to deploy all the stuff that are probably best practices in a lot of other industries. And then they'll be making the same kinds of decisions and improvements that these other industries would on, how much stock to order, what sizes for t-shirts to have. There's also interesting nuances too, because, for example, they travel around, right, on tour and do 20, 30, 40 stops on a tour. They have to take merchandise with them. Well, how much merchandise do you take with you is a question that we get, right? Or, I spoke with one artist manager who had a band who did a killer first tour, and they were so excited. They got to the end of the tour, and then they said, where's all the money we made on the tour? And he pointed at the 15,000 t-shirts they had over there and said, that's all your profits from the tour. The merch company overordered everything, and so we got to sell through all of this stuff. And so it's really a fascinating business because they're all these artists operate like small businesses, but without all of the support and the resources that you would typically have if we were in like Silicon Valley and they were starting a business in tech, or down here in LA in Silicon Beach, right? There's a lot of, if you're in tech, right, there's a lot of different services you could use, but also you're not running so many different lines of business. Whereas here they have a lot of different lines of business, right? They have recorded music, they have merchandise, they have touring, they have publishing, they have consumer products, right, and partnerships. And so they're running a lot of different lines of business, oftentimes with a staff of between 2 to 4 people. And so our goal is to help them make these kinds of decisions that I think would be probably things that those of you who work in other industries would be like, oh yeah, we're already putting together data to do that, but do it in a scalable way so that the hundreds of people that support these artists across our portfolio can use these tools, and we don't have to have, pick up the phone and call a data scientist every time you need a report or something,
That's really cool. That rounds out like my understanding of what you're doing a bunch, and it's really, really interesting. Sort of creating an ecosystem of these data services that connect in a bunch of places to where these artists and their teams work. That's really neat. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. And we're doing it all on with Shiny apps for those of you who like Shiny apps.
I love it. It's awesome. I mean, it's cool to hear like all these different lines of business. It's like each artist is running their own startup. And I was wondering, like, what are a few recent lessons for you learned in going from a huge company like Warner Brothers to a startup?
Yeah, it's definitely been an interesting experience. I've always had a bit of a kind of a romanticism about going to a startup. And so, I spent most of my career working at Fortune 500 or Fortune 100 companies. And so so I think it's definitely, there's a lot more focus on, putting things out as fast as possible, because there's there's constantly more scrutiny because of board meetings and things like that. There's more visibility in a 40-person company on the work everybody is doing. And so that's really important to think about. And then the other thing is the ability to get things done is sometimes easier and sometimes harder. So sometimes it's easier because, there's less bureaucracy and there's, less people to talk to and stakeholders to solicit. It's like, oh, you want to go do this thing? Great. If it's valuable, just go do it. But at the same time, you're also resource constrained, right? So it forces you to think really creatively. Whereas in Warner Brothers, I had a P&L and a budget, and I operated within the confines of that and come up with a bunch of ways of doing things. Now it's like, okay, I have a much smaller amount of budget, a much smaller team to work with. So how do we accomplish something similar with like 1/10 or 1/50th the resources? And so that's forced me to think really creatively, and it's been really interesting to do that.
Thank you. Junaid, I see you have your hand raised. Do you want to jump in here next?
Yeah, so hi Adam. One question. So let's say if the songs of the artists are on different platforms, Apple Music and Spotify, do you get that data from the distribution platforms, that how the songs are doing on those platforms?
Good question. So if they do the recorded music with us, so we have a division called Firebird Label Services that supports artists. So we just put out, for example, Slash's new album, Orgy of the Damned. And we put out a number of other albums through this division. If they were putting their music out directly through us, we use a company called Fuga to distribute that music. And then Fuga gets the raw feeds from Spotify, Apple Music, everybody else, and they share that back with us. If the music's going out through like a Warner or a Universal or someone like that, they don't tend to share the data with us, although I'm asking. But typically the major labels like to keep that data to themselves, is my understanding. But so we do get some data back, but it's really the reason why we get that data back, and that the DSPs, or what they're called, the direct streaming platforms, the reason why they share that back is, and I see Edgar's comment, yes, Guns N' Roses Slash, that is correct. The guy with the big tall hat. The reason why this data is shared back is really for royalty calculations, because we have to pay out the royalties on the songs. And so that's the reason why this data is shared back. But the good news is that over time, people have added additional data to it, based on customer requests, mostly from the major labels. So for example, our Spotify data could just come back with, here's the number of streams for each song per day, and maybe a user ID, so you can validate that, like there's no fraud going on. But instead, it also comes back with like, here's the source of the stream, and here's the like the demographics, like an age and gender bin, like this person is male and he's 18 to 24, and he's listening in Los Angeles, right? And so we do get some additional data like that. The flip side of that is every platform is doing it differently, and every data feed is different. So and there's dozens of platforms globally, and so there's very little uniformity in the data, other than the number of streams per day for royalty calculations.
Got it. So one follow-up question. So you're managing international artists as well, like your company?
Yeah,
Okay.
Defected and Transgressive are based in the UK. And then all music we do gets distributed globally typically. So unless it's something where we're only doing it for a specific territory, like a distribution deal of some sort, which we have a division called Graduation that does that. So so they do it for like Russ or Diddy or other folks, where they'll do the international distribution for them, and their label will do the US. Unless it's something like that, normally we do things globally.
Got it. Thank you.
Rui Chen, I see you had a question in the chat. Do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again, Adam, for joining us on this talk. This has been super interesting so far. So I'm very, very curious about the challenges that you have encountered given your long history in the entertainment industry. So you've provided examples that streaming kind of changed how artists make their money. And with these changes, I would imagine that it would yield new data challenges. What challenges did these disruptors present in your line of work, and how did your team adapt to these changes? You've already mentioned that, just given the fast pace of the industry, that you guys have to be nimble. Do you have any tips and tricks that you have implemented in your teams that you would like to share with all of us?
Sure. So I think this is a few questions combined. So let's go through it one at a time. So I think we want a few challenges, then we want some tips and tricks. Is that a good way to summarize it?
Yep.
Okay. So so challenges, I mean, definitely across all of entertainment, there are challenges. I think music, live events is making up for a lot of the revenue, and there's some great projections. Goldman Sachs has an annual report called Music in the Air, which if you search with Perplexity. Perplexity can find it pretty well. If you Google it, you may not find it. But Perplexity is good at finding, obscure PDFs that you can't find otherwise. And this is not a paid endorsement for Perplexity. So these kinds of research reports clearly show that the music industry is growing really quickly, which is good, but there are challenges and headwinds still, right? So for example, the transition to streaming was a bit rocky, and then if you've paid attention to the news, Universal, Warner Music, a few others have been going through and doing some layoffs. Same with the larger like film and TV entertainment companies where I used to work, right? Or where some other folks on the call like Junaid work. And so, it's really, there's a bit of a shift in power over time between the companies that own the content and the means of distribution. So, and then tech platforms, right? And so the platforms are really the ones that are in more control and have more data. And so I think the challenge for companies that are not the platforms now over time is really going to be figuring out how do you either build your own platforms, which some of the folks in film and TV are doing in the streaming space, for example. And that way you can own the platform, you can monetize it, and you can have access to all of the data. Or if you're like Firebird, or you're an independent producer or a production company in film and TV, how do you get access to enough data that you can then make strategic decisions and collect that together in a way that, you can cost effectively figure out what is the audience I'm building this for, who are my fans, how do I reach people, how do I grow my business, right? Without necessarily being, solely reliant on things like traditional market research, right? Or, there's tools like Demographics Pro that people in the industry will use, which are largely modeled, right? And for a lot of you on the call who, work in this kind of stuff, as we know, the problem with modeling things based on demographics is, the interests tend to cut across demographic lines, right? So I always used to say at Warner Brothers, Batman fans are 8 to 80, so you can have, it cuts across lines, and so it's the same thing with music. I'll talk to people who are, in their 20s, and they'll be like, I love Lionel Richie, he's one of our artists. And, I love Lionel Richie, and, this last big songs came out in like the 80s, right? Or I'll talk to people who are 65 and who are like, oh man, you have Lionel Richie, we love Lionel Richie, right? And then tips and tricks, I would say, it's important, depending on the type of company you're at, to think creatively about the types of data you use. I find that there's a little bit of a curse of data sometimes, where the bigger your internal data, the more likely you are to only look at your data for answers. And there's really a wealth of data out there that you can use for augmenting your internal data and helping you build models and make decisions. And I would say that, I spent a lot of time early on Kaggle, and, that's really where I thought a lot about, there were these competitions with external data. And, it really taught me to think creatively about what other data could you bring to solve these problems. And whereas, like when I would work in companies, it was like, oh no, we have the Call of Duty data. We know everything everybody did on our platform. Why do we need additional data? And I'm like, well, we had a 20% drop in users and nothing changed in our game, and another competitive game came out. We should probably be seeing, instead of assuming that it just came from that competitive game, getting additional data to see, how many people are playing that game versus they're doing other things, right? And so, so it's really important to think about that as a important tip or trick, as you will, to maybe a little bit more than a trick, but really a philosophy to think about how you apply data science in whatever industry you're in, right? Is to think about the source of your data and think about creatively, are there ways you can augment that data with other data sets from the outside?
I
Thank you.
remember Adam once brought SafeGraphs data to understand the mobility to solve problems in the studio. So I second him.
Yes, Junaid was, full disclaimer, Junaid was on my team a few years ago at Warner Brothers.
I was just gonna say, seems like you both know each other. I love when there's something that so many people can relate to, like music. There's so many awesome questions coming in. George, you had asked a question a little bit earlier about when things don't meet your expectations. Do you want to jump in? And I can read it if you want to add context, feel free. But it's, what are some examples of when results of your analysis went against the expectations of the artist How do artists and or their management react to data that goes against their assumptions?
That's a great question. I would say that that's not just in music, that's everywhere, right? Where, you know, when you think about it, sometimes as data professionals, we are the bearer of bad news. And sometimes we're the bearer of something unexpected, which could be really exciting. And so it's a double-edged sword, right? I think you know, where something didn't go their way, right, or something wasn't what they're expecting, I would say in music, people are pretty positive. Like, you know, it's not that difficult to produce new music. You're not spending hundreds of millions of dollars on it like a film. I would say it was a lot tougher in film and TV. Like if you're working on a marketing campaign for a film where we've already spent $150 million, we're spending $50 million to market this film, and like no one is showing any interest in seeing this film. Those are tough conversations to have, where you have to go like, I'm sorry, I know that we're really optimistic about this movie, but the numbers clearly indicate that you know, we are way behind on pre-sales from where we should be if we want this to open to $100 billion. And you know, those are tough conversations to have. I will say that it's one of those things where I have learned that different people respond to that information in different ways, and you have to be attuned to that type of person and understand what type of person you're communicating with. Some people, you know, they're very receptive and they're open. And with those people, it's good to share additional context and, you know, make sure they understand why. Other people, they shut down and become very defensive and feel like you're attacking them. And so if it's that kind of person, you have to be very careful when sharing negative information. Don't only share positive information. That's a mistake. But you may need to like couch it in softer terms and make sure that you, you know, give something that seems more like a balanced perspective. Don't just give all negative news. Say, look, you know, there are some positives here, but there's also some negatives you should pay attention to. And then that might be more well received by someone who has a penchant for being more standoffish or defensive when they hear negative news.
Thank you. Stephen, you had a question about earlier that touched on like artists who want to do their own analytics. Do you want to jump in? I see you unmuted.
Yeah.
We can't.
Yes.
Yet.
Okay. There I
Yep.
am. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for coming back to that. I mean, Adam mostly covered it in a previous answer, but you know, there are a few artists out there who are, you know, have part of their name is that they're famous for their independence or their, you know, their sort of like hands-on approach. And so I'm curious if there's ever been anybody like that. Especially, I could imagine maybe an artist that, you know, works on computers anyways might have a really just interest in analytics and whatnot. Are there those? Have you encountered those kind of people? And if so, you know, sort of how do you work with them? And I'm also curious too about, you've described the ways in which you know, create reports for people, but how do you also educate them in understanding these things? Because some of these are maybe complex ideas that can't always be boiled down to like a univariate statistic or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. So so for the first one, I would say that typically we work with artist managers directly, not the artists as much. The artist managers, we have an affiliate program where sometimes, you know, if they don't want to go join a bigger company or something, they can affiliate Firebird, and that's typically how we work with them. The you know, there are online platforms like you know, that just do TikTok distribution or that do like music distribution to the different streaming platforms. And so sometimes some of those provide analytics for you. So the tech savvy folks can use things like CD Baby, which is also owned by Fuga, or other platforms to distribute their music and then get raw data back through that, or some sort of form of their data. It might be slightly aggregated in a helpful view. And then, sorry, the second part of the question was?
It was basically saying, you know, I do a lot of, in my work, I do a lot of education related to, you know, data. So, so how do you explain these things to people without having it take up all your time, you know?
Yeah, so I would say that it's a combination of when we roll out the tools to people, we kind of walk them through how they work and educate them a little bit. And we always answer questions or do follow-ups, and that's helpful. You know, I have a neuroscience background from my time at UC San Diego. And so one of the most important things we learn in neuroscience is, you know, that the repetition really breeds learning. And so, you want to strengthen those neural connections between the different areas. And so it's important to have follow-ups and touch bases and make sure that people are finding it useful, and then reinforcing those concepts and tying things together is another way that, really helps with learning. If you have one concept you understand, you tie things to that concept. There's a concept of like a neural attractor, but basically like you can think of it as if you tie things to other concepts, it makes it easier to remember because it's part of something that you already know. And so so that helps. And then in the tools themselves, we had little tool tips and things like that sometimes with question marks. Rebecca on my team does a great job at this. And so putting these in places you can mouse over, and it explains to you this is the definition of this metric, or in context. And so that way, if you're like, oh, what does this like first time purchaser index really mean, you can mouse over and says, oh, it's like this divided by this gives you this index. And it's like, cool. You know what I mean?
That makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So one of the artists who likely does their own analysis, Mike Smith here, I see you had a question on the models that are used. Do you want to jump in?
I'm the very worst kind of musical data scientist because I never look at my statistics. I can count the number of streams and plays in one hand. But the question I had for Adam was more, you're clearly making predictions and recommendations based on patterns of what has happened before and such. But as I imagine that occasionally you get big events like Taylor Swift announces her Eras tour, or Coldplay drop a new album, which has potential to disrupt large parts of supply chain, merch, production, vinyl pressing, and so on. So do your models allow for those kinds of big events happening?
Yeah, so our label services team does we have Scott Bergman, who's the VP of physical over there, who does all the like vinyls and everything, like for Slash's album that I mentioned, and a few others. And so we've discussed this a little bit. I think the issue there is that the release schedules for these things aren't announced that far in advance. And so so it's difficult to do that. We've talked about building a predictive model to predict kind of, there's some seasonal trends. Yeah. But there's also like just a lot of variation, right? I mean, you can think of it like a buy till you die model, right? For lifetime value, for those who've done lifetime value modeling. It's kind of like there's a distribution that you can figure out of like how often artists are releasing albums. Some people release really often, and it's like clockwork, and some people it's like, hey, it's been 6 years, maybe there's an album coming out, And so so I think that's probably how I would model it if we do go down that route. But we're definitely not at the point of that yet. We're still very far away. We're still doing basic stuff like lifetime value modeling for e-commerce and things like that, which are table stakes in other industries, but stuff that is new to this industry.
I mean, I guess it would be a wee bit more like the insurance industry or reinsurance, betting against hurricanes or something like that, right? For example, we've just had an enormous hurricane blowing through the Caribbean in the last couple of weeks, but that's the earliest that there's been a hurricane of that magnitude. So that would be an unusual thing to happen, right? And so if you're then predicting how much should we have available for reinsurance, then suddenly something weird has happened and it's big. And so do you then bank on that happening more regularly, or do you just go, well, that's a freak occurrence?
Yeah, do you just remove it from the model as an outlier, or do you include it in the probabilities now? And there's a non-zero probability in the future of it happening at this time of year.
Do we just refer to Taylor Swift as a hurricane? Is that
I didn't say anything of the sort.
We are all Taylor Swift fans on this call. This is recorded. We don't want anyone to think otherwise.
I am, but I see Will, your hand's raised. Want to jump in?
Yeah, at my own work, I've been thinking a lot about data quality lately, and I'm just curious to know, like, what are some of the messiest or least reliable data sources you have right now, and maybe what you're doing to mitigate those problems?
So definitely the streaming data is messy because it comes in a lot of different formats, and there's not much of an incentive for the DSPs to really clean a lot of that up and make it easy to drive insights from it. And so in talking to other people, I find that, some of the larger labels, they tend to just like archive it and use it for reporting because of that and not even do any modeling off of it. Maybe they are doing modeling and I just haven't found the right people to tell me they're doing modeling. But for now, all I've heard is that they're basically just archiving it and doing basic reporting off of it because the amount of time and investment it takes is difficult. But we are investing that time and effort. I would say the other thing is when you get data from different data providers, like third parties that you license data from, it can come in various forms. And so sometimes you can get really clean, easy to use data that, you just run a query on and it just works. I would love to meet those providers because most of mine, there's still work we have to do with modeling the data, cleaning it up, enhancing it, augmenting it, you get a album and it's like, who's the artist that is this album actually being released, or a song, it's just a list of artists. It's like, who is the one that actually was the primary artist on this track? Well, we have to figure that out now. Or it's, with other data sources on concert ticket sales, it's like, great, here's the name of the event and on the secondary market. And, apparently on the secondary market, whoever's plugging the events on StubHub or Vivid Seats, one of those platforms, decided to put Death Cab ampersand postal service on one, Death Cab A&D postal service on another one, capitalize on some, lowercase on others, slash on some in between Death Cab and postal service. So, and then, there's festivals and all sorts of stuff. And so there's lots of data cleaning and enhancement that's needed on a lot of different data sources. I would say that the data cleaning and enhancement seems to be one of the barriers that a lot of people have had in the music industry, from what I've been learning. We are investing that time and effort, and, we are using AI to help with some of that too. But, it's definitely something where I feel like the scale of the data, because it's so big, like just on our scale alone, we're at the hundreds of millions of streamers just from our catalog and from these extracts and billions of rows of streams. And we are not big by any means, shape, or form. So you can imagine the trillions or maybe quadrillions of streams that the Warner Musics and the Universal Musics of the world probably have in their data lakes, right? And then you can imagine how Herculean of a task they probably think it is to clean all that up. So I think we're fortunate that we're starting at a smaller scale and building this infrastructure when we're smaller, and then we're building it so we can scale as the company grows.
I see Michelle asked a question that is starting a great conversation in the thread there, which I haven't had a chance to read through, but it's, how do you approach developing and maturing new data science or analytics teams? Our team wants to expand capabilities to more complex data projects, but we don't really have an experienced data science member to mentor us.
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, I would say, first of all, that, we've done a few different things on different teams I've been in before. So and it's not just sometimes you don't have a more experienced member to mentor you. Sometimes that if you have a more experienced person, but they might have projects assigned to them and be busy, and you want to grow other people on the team into this discipline, then that can be another reason why. It's not just because you don't have someone experienced, but we've done a few different things. So we've enrolled people in courses before. Here in LA, there's like Masters in Applied Statistics program. There's other programs that are really good. There's also a lot of online courses and materials. So a lot of folks on my team have done like Coursera type stuff before. There's AI is really good too. Like ChatGPT has a good understanding of these things, the algorithms. I think it's important always to make sure that you understand how the algorithms work though when you're using them, and that you take the time and invest in understanding how it works and not just making it a black box where, hey, I ran the code and I got an output. Because it's very easy to make mistakes that way and to use the right algorithm on the wrong problem or use the wrong algorithm on the right problem. And those are both different types of mistakes that are easy to make in data science if you're not careful. You need to frame the problem correctly, and you need to understand what is the right algorithm to use to correctly model that problem. And so I think it's really important that we educate team members through a variety of different sources. But I would say that if you don't have the ability to send people to longer term things like, some sort of, advanced degree program or some sort of certification, then Coursera is great. Also, I would say leverage ChatGPT and the latest AI. The paid solutions are quite good to give you some insight. And then the most important thing is giving people a concrete project they can work on. Because if you have team members who are naturally curious and interested, you know, the human capacity for learning is great. We spend our whole lives learning. Our brain is constantly changing, despite what some people may say. You know, like our brains are constantly tuning and changing the different networks that we have. They're pruning connections, they're enhancing connections. And so I think the most important thing is, you know, have an open learning mindset. And then if you give people a problem and they have this mindset, you give them some space to actually do the research, you know, read papers or read materials online, and make sure that you're just you're checking the assumptions. That's a really important thing. There's sometimes I'll hear things about like, oh, well, there's an article that said to do it this way, so that's the way I did it. And it's great as a starting point, but always make sure that when you have people learning things, especially, that you're checking the assumptions. And it's like, okay, well, why did the article say to do it this way? Are there other ways we should consider doing it? But giving them the space to really experiment. You know, the way we learn is not always by rote material, right? I think there's, you know, auditory and visual learning is very important. But at the same time, you know, we've learned for millions of years as human beings by experimentation with things, right? We, you know, like we saw spots moving in the bushes together and we learned that those spots were a cheetah, right? And so our visual centers slowly tuned to be aware of like when things move together, that's a pattern. We should be aware of that. Or we, you know, like would hit things together and be like, oh, if this hits this, we can open up this coconut and now we can eat it. This is great. You know, and the modern version of that is, hey, I can run an algorithm in Python or R and oh, look, it makes this thing and I can look at it and I can make a graph of it. And this is wonderful. And then now I can do something else with this, right? And so encouraging that natural experimentation and that natural curiosity is a great way to get your team members to learn new things.
I love that. Thank you. I see in the thread that someone had mentioned, I remember Posit has a program for teaching teams about R, and Isabella shared Academy. So I just wanted to make sure I share that there's this event happening next week on July 17th with 3 teams who are going through and sharing their experience using Posit Academy for real world applications of open source and public health. And I just wanted to make sure I shared that here in the chat with you all. I see Azuka had asked a question a little bit earlier that was, how much does charting position on charts like Billboard or music review pages like Pitchfork factor into your analysis? Do you also consider independent music reviewers as well?
So Billboard is actually calculated as a function of the number of streams and album sales. So it's not necessarily like the Hot 100, for example. It's not necessarily reviews. They do review albums as part of Billboard, the magazine. And so so the reviews themselves, we don't really pay that much attention to because we're not doing the creative side of things, right? But the rankings like the Hot 100 or the Billboard 200, we do pay attention to because those are reflective of streaming and sales numbers. And those are important both as inputs and outputs in different types of models.
Thank you. I'm trying to make sure I get to as many questions as possible here. I just want to make sure there weren't some that I missed earlier. Mehdi, I see you had you had 2 questions. I wanted to make sure I give you an opportunity to ask one of them. You may have dropped, but I think the question was more so, Adam, about learning what your typical day at work looks like.
It's a lot of meetings. Unfortunately, what I found through my career is the more senior you get, the more meetings you have. So that is unfortunately a sad fact of life. I do try to block out here at Firebird. You know, Warner Brothers, I try to block out Wednesday afternoons between like 3 to 7 for individual coding time. You know, I really value the ability to be hands-on and code and build models or apps or things like that. And so so it's definitely something I value. And here at Firebird, I do that about 3 days a week, which is really nice. So I get about like 10 to 12 hours of individual contributor time. Sometimes there's a stack of emails that eat into that time, unfortunately, or like a last minute meeting or something. But typically my day will start off about, you know, between 7:30 or 8:30 in the morning. We have people in the UK and people on the East Coast in Firebird. And so we have a lot of morning meetings with them. And then over time, I'll shift into more one-on-ones or project-focused meetings. I will try and schedule a couple of breaks in my day, just because if I don't schedule them, then I won't have any breaks. And I'll be working nonstop till about 2 or 3 o'clock when the East Coast folks go offline. And then after that, I'll take a break for lunch or something, and then I'll typically come back and try and do individual contributor coding. There's a lot of good studies that show that your energy tends to, be multimodal. You have like a peak in the morning, and then tends to tend downwards, and then after lunch you have another peak, and then trends downward after that. And so, and for those of you who follow like Andrew Huberman, he talks about ultradian cycles. And so there are these ultradian cycles. I encourage everybody to try and leverage those. And so I try and time my day around my ultradian cycles if I can. And so hence the timing of my lunch is a little bit later in the day than most people would have. And then I get a peak of energy after lunch where I can hopefully get through some machine learning or some modeling of some sort.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Okay, I know we have a few minutes left for questions, so I'll ask the Posit team behind the scenes to help gather the ones that we've missed. But I know Nitesh, you had asked a question in the chat a little bit earlier. Want to jump in now? And I can start by reading it. If you want to jump in, you unmuted. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to learn if you have any interesting data fact from the music industry over the course of your time there, like something the rest of us wouldn't even think about or like know. Like the one I had in mind was something like, which city listens to the most music on the planet? But you can choose anything you want.
That one, I could probably look that up, but I actually haven't checked that one. That's an interesting thought, though. We probably have that data in our database, at least from Spotify, because Spotify publishes the top 50 cities for every artist. No, I think the most interesting things are really, there's a lot of stuff about like one-hit wonders, or like people who, their first album is a hit and, they have multiple hits on it. And it actually tends to be a minority of artists. What's really interesting is that, it's about like 1/3 of artists roughly have a hit in their first year of their career. And, and what's interesting is we now see self-releases too, because people can self-publish. So that number goes down when you include self-releases more to like 1/8. Rebecca on my team, who I see on the call here, she is doing all that great analysis. And there's also a great paper from Stanford published by this gentleman, Berg, in 2022 on music careers, which I encourage everyone who's interested in this stuff to look at, which has a lot of these great stats in it. We're just replicating his work right now. And so, so I'd say that was really interesting. And then the other thing that we've noticed is that, there's more and more artists looking at like the Hot 100 data. I talked about that's one of the things we look at. There's more and more artists having hits on the Hot 100 further on into their careers than ever before. And so, you can look at like Billy Joel had a top 100 hit last year when he released his new album, right? And, he's like 50 years into his career at this point, still having hit songs. And I'd say that's a really interesting thing to think about, both from like a consumer perspective and as a fan, as well as like a business perspective, because, artists are having longer lasting careers, which is part of our goal at Firebird. But it also means that, there's only so much time and so much space to listen to music. And there's platforms that made it a lot easier to release music. And then on top of that, it's also easier for artists to have communication and relationships with their fans now in this new era, right? You have social media, you have email, right? Imagine trying to release an album if you were like, I don't know, someone from the 1930s, like Perry Como, the 1970s or 80s, right? Like every music label would be like, no, I'm sorry, you're past your prime. We're onto this new hot young thing. Bon Jovi is where it's at. Like, I don't know why Perry Como wants to do an album, right? Whereas now they can see like, oh man, there's like 30 million people a month streaming, Billy Joel. Like, I bet a ton of people would listen to a new song from him. Yes, we as Sony Music will definitely do a new song with him. Because one of the things we never got to see before, which now we can see, which is really interesting, so we get to see through the streaming platforms how much you listen to music that's not new, it's not frontline. It's called catalog, music that's 18 months or older. And catalog is actually the majority of streaming, which is a really fascinating statistic. It's not something that people outside the industry really know, But, you know, if you look at the top 1,000 artists, actually, there's a ton of artists who have been deceased for sometimes decades, who are in the top 1,000 artists on streaming, you know, because people love the music and keep listening to it. And so, so it's really interesting that, you know, those are some interesting facts that, you know, it's really, artists are, you know, not necessarily having hits at their beginning of their career. That's not as common. It's a common story in the news and the narrative, but that's actually the less common case. And then the you know, artists are having hits longer into their career, sometimes as long as 50 years or later after their first hit. And then on top of that, you know, a lot of listening is actually for catalog and for, you know, like older music. And that's what a lot of people listen to all the time, is they listen to their favorites, which you know, we wouldn't know, but now we know because of streaming.
That's really cool. Thank you. Actually, you just saying this made me think of a question I probably should have prepared beforehand, but I recently listened to this like Randy Travis song. It was like an AI song that hit the Billboard country charts, and he had health issues, so they used AI to make this song with his voice. And I was just curious, like you just mentioned some of the top artists actually being deceased. Like, what do you think is to come in that space, and what are your thoughts about that?
Oh my goodness, that's a huge question. Now, I
Well,
think that,
yeah, you don't have to give us like a long thing, but just,
no, it's okay.
I know I asked that with 3 minutes left, so.
I think there's a huge potential for disruption, but I don't think it's, I think some people think it's going to be bigger than it actually will be, because we as human beings tend to be ingrained in the way of doing things, and you know, we continue to follow some of the same patterns. I think there's going to be new and novel use cases, like the Randy Travis thing might be a good one. And so there may be ways that people think about using this, but I also think that we as humans also have some like ethical things. So I don't know if, like, you know, we'll be doing like Marvin Gaye's estate will be doing new songs by Marvin Gaye. I don't know if that would happen. Maybe it will, you know. I don't know, I could be wrong, but I think that, you know, we as human beings may find that a little bit like icky to have like songs by people who've been long deceased coming out. But you know, I could be wrong. Maybe there'll be a market research study that says that no, actually people love new songs from deceased artists.
Well, okay, one maybe last question just to end with. I always like to ask people about their career advice. So is there a piece of career advice that you've either received over the course of your career or have given someone else that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I would say the piece of career advice that I often give is really and you know, that I've received over the years as well, is really having very frank and transparent communication with the people you work with. You know, as data professionals and people who work in code, it's oftentimes one of those things where we get so enveloped in the code and the problem that, you know, we're just like super into it, and we don't realize that, you know, no one else knows what we're doing. You know, and so communication is very important on a lot of different levels. You know, the frequency of communication and updates, trying to make your complex topics more understandable for, you know, lay audiences. And then also making sure that you share the work you're doing with your colleagues and your peers is really important, because, you know, oftentimes we work as part of teams and organizations. And it's really important to, you know, help the teams and organizations grow and collaborate really effectively, because your work is only as valuable as its usage. And so if you do your work by yourself and it only runs on your laptop and no one else knows how to do it, and you just run it, then, you know, it's not going to be as useful and as helpful. Whereas if it becomes part of a production process and, you know, it supports a large number of customers and it continues to scale out, you know, sometimes we'll feel like, oh, but it was my baby and I don't want to give it up. But at the same time, that actually creates more impact and more visibility. And I think that's helpful to people. And it's sometimes a big issue I see with people early on in their careers, is they often feel partial to the things that they did. And they're like, no, I don't want to like turn it over to this other team, or I don't want to like lose control over it. And so, so it's really important to communicate frequently and share the things that you work on, both from a communication and like a collaboration standpoint.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Adam. This has been really fun. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us and share all your experience.
No, it's my pleasure.
I forgot to add this in the beginning, but I did just want to remind people about Posit Conference, and I have a little like promo code that I just got made for all Hangout people to get the early bird price still. And I completely forgot to say that in the beginning, but it's just DS Hangout. So if anyone didn't register yet, feel free to use that code for the early bird price too. Thank you all for the awesome questions here today too. Have a great rest of the day, everybody.